we are going to start the second session in this panel session. In this panel we are going to have three distinguished presenters. Our first speaker is Dr. Ágnes Matuska, my dear colleague and co-organizer at the Department of English here at the University of Szeged. Her research interests include the representational logic of early modern drama and its medieval origins. She's also co-editor of an online electronic periodical on film studies and visual studies called Apertura. It's something worth checking out. Currently she's engaged in a project doing research into the history of the Teatro Mundi tradition. Our second speaker is Paul Franson from the University of Utrecht. His research interests include Shakespeare and his contemporaries, Austen, Wilde and Coetzee. And our third presenter today in this panel is Rui Carvalho Romero, who is professor of English at the University of Porto. He has published extensively on early modern drama, Shakespeare, and he also takes interest in translation studies and intermediality, and he's also chair of the European Shakespeare Research Association. This is our panel, and the floor first goes to Dr. Matuska, please.
Thanks a lot. So the title of this panel is Shakespeare and Crisis, and this is the beginning of the second week of the program, so we have already heard several potential papers for Shakespeare and Crisis. And before I move on and talk about the specific type of, not so much Shakespeare and Crisis, but Shakespeare's world and Crisis, I would just like to remind ourselves of the possibilities of talking about Shakespeare and Crisis, also in the light of what has been said so far. So crisis as represented in Shakespearean drama, as we have heard in the student presentations, like either representational crisis or social crises, represented in individual dramas, like Othello or Merchant of Venice, we've heard last week, or the crisis of identity on the Shakespearean stage. Also, we've heard from the other panelists in the previous week's panel, papers on Shakespeare and Crisis from the point of view of the crisis of representing Shakespeare on the contemporary stage, right? So there was Cornelia who talked about the Wooster Group's Hamlet. This would qualify here. Or we could also talk about the crisis of Shakespeare as part of a core curriculum for either English majors or humanities students, and there is a really interesting interview worth to check out by Kent Cartwright, who talks about specifically this crisis, the crisis of Shakespeare, and how we are to deal with this in academia, either as Shakespeareans or anti-Shakespeareans. The crisis of Shakespeare's contemporaries not making it to the canon. So this is one of Attila's favorite topics. So that's also a crisis connected to Shakespeare. So I'm interpreting the title of the panel within this larger context, Shakespeare's World and Crisis, and the challenge of its representation in one particular scholarly context. And the specific context and starting point of my investigation is a pragmatic task that I'm involved in as member of a group of researchers who are writing the new and updated history of English literature in Hungarian. And the last such literary history dates back actually to the socialist era, the 1970s, and I'm going to discuss this in more detail. And particularly, as the co-author of the chapter on the questions of periodization in connection with the Renaissance as an era. So this is how I'm involved in this project. But also, not just the Renaissance era, but Renaissance understood as Shakespeare's world. The whole undertaking of this project has been and is still a crucial and formative experience for several of us, Hungarian scholars of English literature and culture, mostly teachers at diverse Hungarian universities, but also professors abroad or doctoral students or secondary school teachers with research background and doctoral degree. So they all contribute to this project. So this is a massive Hungarian undertaking. The project has become important for us specifically because it forced us to think and talk much more thoroughly and explicitly than usual about what we actually do as researchers and why. One important experience is to realize that the writing of the actual text, which is at present in its final stages, took about as much time as discussing the preferred organizational concept that was to be followed when planning the chapters. From the outset, it was clear that it would not be merely a history of English literature, but rather the Hungarian version of it, and that this specific perspective would also be acknowledged in the title of the volumes. The potential audience of the text is imagined to be anyone from the range of secondary school or university students to the knowledgeable wider public. The term Hungarian in the title of the volumes as a reference to the perspective provides at least two things. It works as a guideline and it gives a sense of liberation. A guideline meaning that chapters are sensitive to topics and works with a Hungarian reception history and their role in Hungarian literature and culture. Such issues, to take some Shakespearean examples, would include the role played by translations of Shakespeare's dramas in the second half of the 19th century, very similarly to other Central European translations in the same era, in creating a renewed literary language and a nation that viewed such translations as their entry ticket to the elite club not only of European literature, but of intellectually refined and powerful European nations. It would also include the significance of productions of Shakespearean history plays in being able to comment on the tyrants and their methods of rule in socialist regime, sometimes against the explicit wish of the direction. As for the sense of liberation that I mentioned, created by the avowedly here and now perspective of the project, rather than endeavoring the impossible task of covering the whole picture, by mentioning major authors and works as in an annotated phone book, importantly, authors were asked to follow their own interest, giving greater or smaller significance to works, authors, genres, or phenomena as they seem fit. Clearly, this subjective viewpoint has been combined with the more comprehensive editorial perspectives already when titles and chapters and subchapters were set. But authors were nevertheless urged to focus on issues that they find important, things that are relevant for them, and as they are relevant for them, beyond the fact that they are potential items of a literary history. Pertaining specifically to the topic of our program, Shakespeare's World and Present Challenges, there is a short subchapter on the question of periodization in connection with the Renaissance as an era, also including the reception history of the Renaissance and the challenge of representing the Renaissance today, with the working title, Changing Images of the Renaissance After the Cultural Turn. So clearly this is a translation of the Hungarian version. When deciding on the changing images that should be included here, at least two contexts have to be taken into consideration. One, changing images of the Renaissance as they both influenced and were entailed by changing interpretations of works regarded as key texts of Renaissance English literature in English-speaking discourses. And two, the change of the image about the Renaissance in England as it was doubly influenced in Hungary by the fall of the socialist regime, and the consequent influence of the finally free and open influx of intellectual schools and scholarly trends, including the ones that can be considered under the umbrella of the cultural turn. As for the first context, an important issue would be to discuss the significance of the introduction of the early modern as an alternative term used for the Renaissance, as well as debates about the relationship between the medieval and the Renaissance. a related issue certainly has to be the change in which the image of the Tilliardian, highly aestheticized and idealized image of the Renaissance was discredited, in which the macrocosmic system was reflected in the human microcosmic order, and both were supposedly reflected in the literary output of the era. Scholars pointed out the related problem, namely that the idea of the worldview as such post-dated the Elizabethans, I quote, like photography, by more than 200 years. This is Margareta de Gracia. Also, as de Gracia suggests, by referring to authors considered to be major figures of the cultural turn, such as Foucault or Althusser, and I hope to have this. Actually, I don't have this quotation on the slide. So this is Gracia. The days of uniform, coherent, and comprehensive historical pictures seem to be over. End of quote. She continues, however, that once the term word picture is replaced by others, apparently more fashionable terms, such as systems of representation, or cognitive mappings, or fantasy constructions, we may wonder whether, I quote, it is possible that ideology might have slipped into the place of world picture as a way of thinking about cultures in the past. And I'm sorry, I don't have it on the slide. I am not sure about the extent to which the playful ambiguity of this question is intentional, namely that ideology might have slipped into the place of world pictures as a way of thinking about cultures of the past. So clearly, the terms quoted here that work almost as synonyms for the world pictures come from scholars who are interested in the ideological constructions governing past discourses. But the other meaning of the sentence, referring to ideologies slipping in as a way of thinking about past cultures, is relevant as well, and quite unavoidably so in the context of writing about Shakespeare, Shakespeare's world, or the English Renaissance in general in a literary history today in Hungary. The relevance is made tangible by the work to which the presently written history of English literature from a Hungarian perspective wishes to be a now acceptable alternative. That other book, the last comprehensive one of this kind up until today, published in the early 70s, surely exemplifies this other, perhaps less obvious meaning of de Gracia's quoted sentence, namely ideologies slipping in while we are thinking about the past. Thus, ultimately, this gives us the second topic to be included in the subchapter on the changing images of the Renaissance that I have mentioned above. The way and the means through which the image of the English Renaissance, also as Shakespeare's world and its literature, has changed in Hungary in the last few decades. So the history of English literature, edited by Miklós Szenci, Tibor Sobotka, and Anna Katona, published in Budapest in 1972, as all academic works of the period, bears the signs of the then ruling socialist ideology. Usual ways to comply with the official requirements were to insert sometimes barely not at all relevant quotations in the text from the main ideological figures, mainly Marx and Engels, and once the mandatory tribute to the fathers was paid, the endeavor was authorized and the investigation could go on. The case with the English Renaissance, as well as Shakespeare as part of it, however, was more specific, precisely because the era plays such an important role in Marx's own writing. For him, it is the English Renaissance that is, on the one hand, the dawn of capitalism, while on the other hand, it is also the first step towards the ultimate liberation of the worker. At the dawn of the Renaissance, workers gain freedom from the feudal ties. The significance is certainly not played down in Szenci's and his colleagues' literary history, in which you can find long passages paraphrasing the relevant 24th chapter of Marx, The Capital. Let me quote quote a sentence exemplifying what these scholars were required to say about the perspective of their undertaking. And I quote, "In the present chapter, we wish to map out the most important literary and human values of the English Renaissance, but not for a moment should we forget about the gloomy events analyzed by Marx and the new enslaving powers of capitalism that were active along with the liberation from feudal ties and the enormous inner tension that lends a particular intensity to the intellectual life and literature of the English Renaissance and which operates most clearly in the conflicts of drama." So the literary heroes of the era will thus be figures who may be representatives of Renaissance humanism, but have to be at the same time critics of the emerging bourgeois class, or at least have to be dissociated from the groups that are regarded as responsible for the rise of capitalism. Shakespeare, for example, fits well in this category, as well as Thomas More. The former did clearly achieve individual material and social success, for which he may be criticized, but he was, quote, anything but obtuse in a bourgeois sense, end of quote. The latter, namely More, may have been a deeply religious man, testifying to his beliefs through martyrdom, but he still condemned the inhumanity of Christian Europe in a way he was ideologically lagging behind the citizens of utopia. As someone who believed in the superiority of revelatory religion, but who still contrasted the rationally designed state of wise and sober pagans with the ignorant, superstitious, and greedy communal spirit of More's Christian England. So this is also, okay, so this was the quotation I was looking for, and this is the one that I've just read out. I would like to remark here that although I'm singling out some of the most ideologically loaded passages from the work, my aim is neither to ridicule the scholarly value of Santis and his colleagues' undertaking, nor to make an impression that this is all that there is. In their time, in the confinement of the ideological era they worked, there was simply no other way to view the English Renaissance, at least not in an officially published literary history. What I would like to draw attention to with these passages is rather the dilemma that is raised by the liberation from the ideological constraints. If the backdrop disappears, that has made certain literary works significant in specific ways, what criteria will define the significance of the same or other previously neglected works? The answer to this question regarding the case of the reinterpretation of the English Renaissance after the fall of the regime in Hungary may be looked for in an issue of the journal Helikon, a Hungarian journal, and particularly a volume edited by two of my senior colleagues, Attila Kis and György Endre Szőnyi, who did this groundbreaking volume in Helikon, introducing actually new historicism to the Hungarian discourse. English Renaissance literature may become significant for the reason it is significant in the English-speaking discourse, new historicism. 10 years after the political change, so this is 1998, a complete issue of Helikon, a journal of literary studies that I mentioned, was dedicated to new historicism with translations of some seminal articles, reviews of related volumes, and a bibliography of new historicism, as well as articles by the two editors. Szőnyi republished, so this is 1998, he republished the text he had written a decade before, based on his partially shocking encounter with the new trends in Renaissance studies in America at the end of the 1980s. An element of this shock surely being the fact that while Hungarian academia had finally got rid of the Marxist baggage, leftist literary theories were becoming increasingly powerful in the US. An important moral from reading Szőnyi's article today, in 2017, is that at the time of publishing the article, so both publishings actually, he still imagines his position of a Hungarian scholar of the English Renaissance as of someone who can decide the extent to which these Western trends may or may not be useful or invigorating within the Hungarian intellectual arena. It seems to me that this perspective has disappeared, so perhaps we should do something about this. The discourse that my generation of scholars wishes to enter and is expected to enter based on the metric requirements measuring our academic achievements, where foreign publications are rated more highly than domestic and Hungarian ones, is mainly the English-speaking one. The ideological constraints of the past are gone, but new constraints emerged instead. The new literary history project, in this sense, is an exceptional territory for potential experimentation. What do we want the English Renaissance to be? Do we see the milestones, the guidelines, the values which govern us in constructing its image here and now? And are there perhaps some milestones or values that we would rather have instead of the ones that we do? As a partial answer to this above question, let me finish by two quotations. One is from Szenzi's Literary History, from the chapter on Thomas More, while the other is by a Hungarian scholar, researcher of the Hungarian Academy, specializing in European Renaissance, Pál Ács. Both quotations show the inevitable link that we, literary scholars of the Renaissance and citizens of the EU, have to make in 2017 between the topic of our research and the context in which it is reproduced. Thomas More's last work, reminiscent of Boethius, entitled A Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, was written before his execution during his imprisonment. Two Hungarian noblemen are debating on the eve of Mohács, the Mohács battle which was lost against the Ottoman Empire in 1526, how to prepare for martyrdom in case the Turk occupies the country. The reference to Henry VIII's tyrannical despotism and to More's own fate is obvious, but equally clear is the reference to the catastrophic consequences of the dissolution of European unity. The fear of the dissolution of the European unity, Hungary's image of a country that is at the border of Christianity, as well as the threatening image of a Muslim invasion, ideas known from contemporary political and ideological battles that crucially affect not only our Hungarian everydays, but also our common European and indeed global future, are too topical today to even suppose that our scholarly and academic interpretations and representations of the Renaissance are not embedded in or do not contribute to the reproduction, questioning, or replacing of contexts that ultimately define our worldview and also who we become or choose to become through them. And the other longer quotation on the interpretation of the Renaissance, taken from an interview by Pál Ács, whom I mentioned, may serve us to give a point of reference on the actuality of the debates about the meaning of the Renaissance. So sorry, it's a bit longish, but really interesting, I hope. So I'm going to read this out, and that's the end of my presentation. We all know that the widely speaking knowledge about the Renaissance era, the Renaissance man, were not created in the 15th, 16th century, but in the 19th. So this is also what Grazia said in the quotation. And then they are not so much the reflections of Petrarca's, Ficino's, or Michelangelo's worldview as they are of Michelet, Voigt, and Burckhardt. In other words, they are the modern European bourgeoisie's own image projected back into a period preceding them a few hundred years. This is precisely why several people deny that the Renaissance era was the age of the early new era or early modern, and their understanding is that all these countries as they are all these centuries as they are belong to the Middle Ages and lack any modernity whatsoever. I cannot accept this, although I know very well how strong the medieval ties of the Renaissance were. I'm not referring to well-known facts that clearly prove that European culture changed radically in the 15th and 16th centuries and a whole new world opened. Similarly, I'm not pointing to the radically new forms and ways of seeing in the art and literature that the Renaissance brought forth, following the models of antiquity, first in Italy and later in the whole Europe, including Hungary. I would rather like to voice a hunch, according to which recent attacks against the Renaissance may be related to even more aggressive accusations against the Enlightenment and liberalism as its progeny. The idea of the Renaissance is indeed the brainchild of bourgeois thinking, and today it is rejected by those who reject liberalism in its entirety. I am a follower of liberalism, and among several other reasons, this is one that fuels my interest in the Renaissance. So this is Palach, with which I finish. Thank you.